Welcome back to Finance Empire Real Life Stories. Have you ever felt that strange silence when you walk into a room and people suddenly stop talking? Or maybe you've smiled with your co-workers during lunch while secretly wondering what they really think about you when you're not around. In today's story, we are diving into one of the most painful realities of modern office life. Gossip, fake friendships, and the hidden pressure to change yourself just to fit in. But this is not just a story about workplace rumours, it's a story about confidence, identity, and learning how to stand tall even when people try to make you feel small. And while you enjoy this emotional journey, you'll also improve your English naturally. You'll learn advanced workplace vocabulary, emotional expressions, and real-life communication skills that native speakers use every day in professional environments. So wherever you're watching from, grab a coffee, relax, and ask yourself one question before we begin. If people laughed at the real version of you, would you change who you are just to make them comfortable? Because that's exactly what happened to Julian. Julian always felt slightly different from the rest of the office. While everyone else wore trendy sneakers, tight black shirts, and talked about celebrity gossip or football scores, Julian arrived every morning looking like he had stepped out of an old, classic novel. He wore polished leather shoes, vintage blazers, neatly folded pocket squares, and spoke with careful, formal language that made people pause for a second before replying. But Julian didn't care about standing out. He simply enjoyed being himself. Or at least, he used to. The trouble began on an ordinary Tuesday morning during the quarterly marketing review meeting. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and printer paper, while employees lazily scrolled through presentations, waiting for the meeting to end. Sarah, the project lead, connected her laptop to the large monitor at the front of the room. "All right, everyone, let's look at this month's engagement metrics," she announced confidently. The colourful spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Then suddenly, a notification popped up in the corner. The message came from a private group chat called The Inner Circle. "Check out Julian's professor outfit today. Does he think he's teaching at a university?" A second message followed immediately. "Wait until he says, 'I shall endeavour.' He talks like a Shakespeare character." A wave of uncomfortable silence swallowed the room. Sarah panicked and quickly closed the notifications, but the damage was already done. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. But somehow the silence hurt even more than laughter would have. The people he trusted, the people he spent every day with, had created a private digital space just to mock him. The meeting ended awkwardly. Chairs scraped against the floor. Employees avoided eye contact. Some hurried out pretending they had urgent emails to answer. Julian stayed frozen in his chair for several seconds after everyone left. His charcoal blazer suddenly felt unbearably heavy. That afternoon, Julian couldn't focus on his work. Every sound in the office became suspicious. Every whisper felt dangerous. Every burst of laughter from the break room sounded personal. By lunchtime, curiosity mixed with heartbreak pushed him toward a terrible decision. Sarah had accidentally left her tablet unlocked on her desk. Julian stared at it for several seconds. He knew it was wrong. But betrayal has a strange way of overpowering logic. Slowly he opened the messaging app, and what he found completely shattered him. The chat history stretched back months. There were screenshots of Julian during meetings, pictures of his clothes, voice recordings mocking the way he spoke. They called him the Victorian. Sometimes they rated his outfits like judges at a fashion show. Other times they laughed about how formal he sounded while answering emails. One message read, "If Julian says furthermore one more time, I'm going to lose my mind." Another said, "I swear he practices speeches in the mirror before work." Even Mark, the department manager, had joined in. Julian stared at the screen feeling numb. The cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was organised. Daily. Routine. He quietly placed the tablet back on the desk and walked to the restroom where he locked himself inside a stall just to breathe. That evening, Julian sat alone in his apartment, replaying every interaction from the past year. Every smile now looked fake. Every compliment sounded sarcastic in retrospect. For the first time in his life, he became deeply aware of himself. Too aware. The next morning, he changed the way he spoke. Instead of saying, "I shall send the report shortly," he forced himself to say, "Yeah, I'll send it." Instead of his vintage blazer, he wore a plain black jacket, identical to everyone else's. He even watched videos online about how to sound more casual. But pretending to be someone else was exhausting. Every sentence felt rehearsed. Every movement felt artificial. And worst of all, the mockery didn't stop. He noticed Sarah staring at his new shoes and whispering something to Mark before they both laughed quietly. Julian realised something painful. People who enjoy mocking others will always find a reason. If it isn't your clothes, it becomes your voice. If it isn't your voice, it becomes your personality. Trying to become invisible only erased pieces of himself. Days passed and Julian slowly transformed into a quieter, emptier version of himself. He stopped sharing ideas during meetings. He avoided lunch with co-workers. He even stopped wearing colours because he worried they might attract attention. The office no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a stage where he was constantly being judged. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. While sitting alone in the cafeteria, Julian heard a calm voice across the table. "That jacket doesn't suit you." Julian looked up nervously, expecting another insult, but instead he saw David from the IT department. David was known as the quiet genius of the company. He rarely joined office gossip and mostly kept to himself. Julian forced a weak smile. "I'm trying something different," he replied carefully. David shook his head. "No," he said calmly. "You're hiding." Julian froze. David opened his lunch container and continued speaking casually. "I saw the messages during that meeting last week. I know about the group chat." Julian immediately felt embarrassed, but David simply shrugged. "They did the same thing to me years ago because I bring homemade kombucha to work and don't care about sports." Julian blinked in surprise. "You?" he asked. David laughed softly. "People attack what makes them uncomfortable, especially when someone seems comfortable being different." The words hit Julian deeply. David leaned forward slightly. "Listen carefully," he said. "Most people in that office are terrified of standing out. That's why they attack anyone who does." For the first time in weeks, Julian felt the pressure inside his chest begin to loosen. He realised something important. The gossip wasn't actually about him. It was about their insecurity. The following Monday, Julian stood in front of his closet staring at his old charcoal blazer. For several long moments, he hesitated. Then slowly, he smiled. He put it on. That morning, Julian walked into the office wearing the exact same style they used to mock. But this time his shoulders were straight. His confidence returned. Later that day, the company held a major presentation for the executive board. As usual, Mark tried to dominate the room with loud jokes and flashy buzzwords. But when executives asked difficult questions, he stumbled badly. Then Julian spoke. Calmly, clearly, confidently. He explained complex marketing trends with intelligence and precision. He used the exact vocabulary people once laughed at. Words like endeavour, nuance, and comprehensive suddenly sounded powerful, instead of strange. The room became silent. Not awkward silent, respectful silent. The CEO leaned forward with genuine interest while Julian explained his ideas with passion and clarity. By the end of the presentation, the executives were nodding in approval. And for the first time, Sarah and Mark weren't laughing. They were intimidated. After the meeting, the CEO personally thanked Julian for his professionalism and insight. That moment changed everything. Julian realised the qualities people mocked were actually the same qualities that made him memorable, intelligent, and valuable. A few days later, Mark attempted one final joke in the break room. "Well, look who's here," he smirked loudly. "The professor himself." But this time Julian didn't shrink. He looked directly at Mark and calmly asked, "I don't understand the joke. Could you explain it?" The room became painfully quiet. Mark stumbled over his words trying to sound funny, but without the protection of the private group chat. His cruelty suddenly looked childish and embarrassing. Julian simply nodded politely and walked away. No anger, no yelling. Just confidence. And somehow, that was far more powerful. A month later, the office atmosphere had completely changed. HR discovered the toxic group chat after messages about senior management accidentally appeared on a projector screen during another meeting. The inner circle quickly collapsed. Some employees were transferred. Others received warnings. But Julian never celebrated their downfall. Instead, he focused on rebuilding himself. One afternoon, a new employee named Maya nervously introduced herself during a team meeting. She spoke carefully, with a thick accent, while clutching her notebook tightly. Julian noticed a few younger employees exchanging smirks. Immediately, he stepped in. "That's an excellent point, Maya," Julian said warmly. "Your perspective is extremely thoughtful." The smirks disappeared instantly. After the meeting, Maya quietly thanked him. "I was afraid people would judge the way I speak," she admitted. Julian smiled gently. "Your voice is not a weakness," he replied. "It's proof that you have lived a different story." And at that moment, Julian understood the most important lesson of all. Confidence isn't about becoming someone everybody likes. It's about refusing to abandon yourself just because a few insecure people feel uncomfortable around authenticity. The office rumour mill tried to turn Julian into a shadow. Instead, it turned him into a leader. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside today's story. Sometimes the qualities that make you feel isolated today become the exact qualities people respect tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. And before you leave, I want you to think about something. Have you ever changed part of your personality just to fit in somewhere? Let me know in the comments, because your story might help someone else feel less alone. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Finance Empire Real Life Stories, and keep practicing your English through real emotions, real situations, and real conversations. And remember, the world does not need another copy of everyone else. It needs the original version of you. I'll see you in part 2. You know, sometimes the hardest battles at work are not the deadlines, the reports, or the pressure from management. Sometimes the hardest thing is simply walking into a room where you no longer feel safe. Julian understood that feeling now, more than ever. After discovering the cruel messages hidden inside the inner circle chat, every morning felt heavier than the last. Even the simple sound of coworkers laughing near the coffee machine made his chest tighten with anxiety. He could no longer tell the difference between normal, office conversation and secret mockery aimed directly at him. But something inside Julian had quietly started to change after his conversation with David in the cafeteria. For days he had tried to erase himself. He changed his clothes, his vocabulary, even the rhythm of his voice, all in an attempt to become invisible. Yet the harder he worked to fit in, the emptier he became. David's words stayed in his mind like a small flame refusing to go out. "Don't let people who are beige on the inside turn you into a shadow." That sentence followed Julian everywhere. On Wednesday morning, Julian arrived at the office earlier than usual. The city outside was still waking up, wrapped in grey clouds and the distant sound of traffic. The office lights flickered softly above the empty cubicles, creating long reflections across the polished floor. For the first time in weeks, Julian wasn't wearing the plain black jacket he had bought to blend in. Instead, he wore his charcoal blazer again, the same one they had mocked in the group chat. As he adjusted the sleeves, he felt nervous but also strangely calm. It was the feeling of someone finally deciding to stop running. When the rest of the staff slowly entered the office, Julian noticed the subtle reactions immediately. Sarah glanced at him and quickly looked away. Mark smirked while pouring coffee. Chloe whispered something under her breath to another co-worker. Normally, those small moments would have ruined Julian's entire day, but this time he simply sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. The silence around him no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt temporary. Around noon, the marketing department gathered for a brainstorming session about a new client campaign. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense but professional. Everyone pretended to focus on the presentation slides, though Julian could sense the familiar undercurrent of judgment moving beneath the surface. Mark leaned back in his chair with his usual smug confidence. "So, Julian," he said casually, spinning a pen between his fingers, "I'm curious, do you practice those old-fashioned speeches at home, or does it just come naturally?" A few people laughed quietly. Before, Julian would have lowered his eyes or forced an awkward smile, but this time he calmly folded his hands together on the table. "I'm not sure," Julian replied evenly. "Do you practice sounding disrespectful, or does that come naturally too?" The room froze. Even Sarah looked shocked. Mark blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for resistance. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, Julian saw uncertainty crack through Mark's confident mask. The silence stretched painfully across the room. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior analysts near the window quietly chuckled. Not at Julian. At Mark. The entire power dynamic shifted in a single moment. Mark leaned back in his chair, suddenly very interested in his phone screen. Sarah avoided eye contact completely. And Julian realised something important. Bullies often appear powerful only because nobody challenges them. The moment someone calmly stands their ground, the illusion begins to collapse. That afternoon, Julian worked with a level of focus he hadn't felt in months. Instead of obsessing over every whisper or glance, he concentrated on the campaign proposal in front of him. His ideas flowed naturally again. His creativity returned. He wasn't wasting energy trying to become someone else anymore. Near the end of the day, David stopped beside Julian's desk holding his usual bottle of fermented tea. "Heard about the meeting," David said with a faint smile. Julian looked slightly embarrassed. "Was I too harsh?" "No," David replied. "You were honest. There's a difference." Julian leaned back in his chair, releasing a slow breath. "I spent weeks thinking I needed their approval." David shook his head. "That's the trap. Some people build their confidence by tearing down anyone who reminds them of their own insecurities." Julian looked around the office floor. The same cubicles, the same fluorescent lights, the same people typing on the same keyboards, yet everything felt different. Now, because he felt different, over the next several days the atmosphere around the office slowly began to change. The whispers became less frequent. The smirks became weaker. Without Julian reacting emotionally, the mockery lost its entertainment value. The inner circle chat still existed, but its influence was fading. Then came the company networking event on Friday evening. The event was held inside a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Employees from every department gathered beneath hanging lights while soft jazz music played in the background. Julian almost didn't attend. Part of him still feared becoming the centre of attention again. But at the last minute, he decided he was done hiding. He arrived wearing his emerald waistcoat, polished shoes, and his signature vintage watch. The moment he entered the rooftop terrace, several heads turned. Julian noticed them, and kept walking anyway. The evening started awkwardly. Small conversations floated around the room, while employees balanced drinks and exchanged forced laughter. Mark stayed near the bar telling exaggerated stories to a group of junior staff. Sarah kept checking her phone nervously. Meanwhile, Julian found himself speaking with one of the company executives about literature, branding psychology, and consumer storytelling. Unlike the shallow office gossip, the conversation felt real and intellectually stimulating. "You have a very distinctive communication style," the executive told him. "It's refreshing." Julian smiled slightly. "I used to think distinctive was a bad thing." The executive laughed softly. "In this industry, memorable people are valuable." Across the terrace, Mark noticed the conversation happening. His confident smile weakened almost immediately. For months, Mark had treated Julian like a joke. Now senior leadership was treating him like future management material. That realization clearly unsettled him. Later that evening, while people gathered near the dessert table, Chloe accidentally knocked her phone onto the floor. The screen lit up as it landed face up near several co-workers. A familiar notification appeared. Inner circle. Look at Julian pretending he belongs with the executives. The group standing nearby saw it instantly. An uncomfortable silence spread through the terrace. Chloe grabbed the phone quickly, but the damage was done. People exchanged uneasy looks. Some walked away quietly. Others looked genuinely disturbed. For the first time, the cruelty of the group chat was no longer hidden behind private screens and whispered jokes. It had become visible, public, embarrassing. And suddenly being part of the inner circle no longer looked clever. It looked childish. Chloe's face turned pale as she backed away from the table. Mark stared down at his drink in silence. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Julian could have humiliated them in that moment. He could have exposed every cruel message and every insult they had shared behind his back. But he didn't. Instead, he simply picked up a glass of water and quietly walked toward the balcony, overlooking the city lights. David joined him a few moments later. "You know," David said, leaning against the railing, "most people spend their whole lives trying to fit into rooms that were never meant for them." Julian looked out across the glowing skyline. And what happens when you stop trying? David smiled faintly. You finally become visible to the right people. For the first time in months, Julian felt completely calm. Not because the rumours were gone, not because everyone suddenly liked him, but because he no longer measured his worth through the opinions of insecure people hiding behind screens. The office rumour mill had tried to convince him that being different was a weakness. But in the end, his individuality became the very thing that earned respect, leadership, and confidence. Sometimes the world pressures you to shrink yourself just to make other people comfortable. But the people who truly succeed are usually the ones brave enough to remain authentic, even when it feels uncomfortable. Julian finally understood something powerful. Confidence is not pretending to be fearless. Confidence is walking into the room as yourself anyway. And as he stood beneath the city lights wearing the same vintage style they once mocked, Julian realised he was no longer surviving the office culture. He had risen above it completely. But little did he know, an even bigger challenge was waiting for him just around the corner, a challenge that would test not only his confidence, but his loyalty, integrity, and future inside the company itself. And that story begins next time,